Okay, we're going to crack on. Please welcome to the stage to discuss, is there a distinctive Island of Ireland response? And as our convener has already pointed out, it's an all-Ireland chat and there's nobody from the north. Ooh. Where's John Barry when you need him? So Patrick is our convener. He's Associate Professor in the Department of Geography at Maynooth University. His work looks at the contested politics of water, land, energy in Ireland. His most recent book, All We Want is the Earth, Land, Labour and Movements Beyond Environmentalism. It was published, when was it published?
July.
July last year?
Last year.
Yeah, this is 2024.
Yeah, last year.
I know. Last year, about a year ago. And it was co-written with Naomi Milner. So this is Patrick. Patrick, take it away.
Thank you, thank you.
I'll share my...
So I understand we're under time pressures and it's the end of the day. So I'm not going to open with any big spiel. My main point was that it's an all-island approach, but no voices from the north. So hopefully... I stole your first... It's all right. So hopefully there will be time for Q&A or comments from the audience, and I will try to prioritize somebody maybe from the north. So I'm going to introduce... I'm going to introduce the whole panel, I think, quickly first, so that we can, get that out of the way. It's a very interesting panel. You've only got 3 or 4 minutes each to talk, so it's such a short amount of time. Good luck with that. So first, we've got Deputy Marc Cathasaigh, who is going to go first because he's got an urgent vote to get to. Marc was elected to represent Waterford constituency in February 2020, previously a primary school teacher and as a member of the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Education. After that, we're going to have Professor Michael Cronin, who is joining us on Zoom, who is Professor of French at TCD and has taught in universities in France and Ireland, and his work is in the area of eco-criticism, travel writing, translation theory, and history. Then I think we will have Annie Fletcher, who is currently the director of IMMA, and is regularly called upon to sit on international juries. I'm kind of condensing these bios for time. Then Saoirse, who is a 19-year-old climate justice activist from Limerick City, who began climate striking at the age of 13. And then we will have Roisin Markham, who is a strategic designer and systems thinker, and the founder and network steward of the Irish Donut Economics Network. And then finally, Seán Conláin, who is a member of Feasta and has been for many years and hosts the Feasta podcast, Bridging the Gaps. Okay, so I'm gonna, yeah. Go ahead, Patrick. Marc.
Yeah, and it's a great example today of how short-term politics interjects on any time you try and do long-term thinking, because I wasn't supposed to be up for a vote at 4 o'clock, but we're electing a new Minister of Finance, so I will be scarpering after my contribution. I suppose the question put to us as a panel is whether there's a specific response that Ireland should have in terms of wellbeing framework. And I strongly believe that there is and there should be. And it's one of the questions actually that was put to the Minister earlier on was around what I termed the 12th indicator. So we have 11 indicators within our wellbeing framework. And where we're very weak is in terms of language and culture. We've seen other examples. So New Zealand is an obvious example. They also built their wellbeing framework around the OECD framework, but they added an extra indicator, an extra dimension to talk about culture and language, and particularly in the New Zealand context around Maori culture and language. But the real world example I try to use to illustrate how I think this is important is my father-in-law. My father-in-law is a Wexford dairy farmer, and milk prices could be down, the weather could be terrible, his leg could have fallen off, his house could have gone on fire. But if Wexford are going well in the All-Ireland Hurling Championship, he's had a good year. And I think when we do a measurement of our well-being that excludes those cultural things, it misses quite a lot. Now, I'm very non-exclusive about how we measure culture. It could be that you got to go to a play in the Abbey. Very nice, Happy you got to do that. You might have gotten to see something in the National Concert Hall. Great. I want to encourage that too. It might be that you saw a session in the pub. It might be that you felt that you could express yourself in a culturally specific way, and that was valued within your society and within your community. And I think a lot of the institutional pushback that we're getting, and I would have been interested to take this up with Nigel directly if I'd had the chance, is that these are difficult things to measure. But I passionately feel that you should decide what it is that you value and then figure out how to measure it, rather than build a framework around what bits of data that you have lying around. The second point I want to make is just around language. I'm an Irish language speaker, not native, worked hard on it. My grammar is still terrible, and native language speakers wince when I say awful things in the Tishel Ginnerdoc, and that's fine. But I do think that we have to make it specific to our own environment, and I know Michael actually has written on this and is far more expert on it than I am. But I do think it's a very important part of our cultural identity. Now, don't tell me how to value it on an economic spreadsheet, because I can't. It's an intangible. But I do believe it has intrinsic value, and it's something, you know, like the Kerry slug or the Natterjack toad or whatever else it is. It only happens here, Irish language. And you can have whatever views you have, you know, about the bloody Tishel Ginnerdoc and the Mo Kenealach and all the rest of it. But it only happens here. And if we don't preserve it here, well, that's an extinction. It's a form of cultural extinction. The third and final point that I'll very briefly make is there was a very powerful metaphor used at the start of this conference, which was the 3 empty seats. And one of the things that I've been working on is future generations and the idea of a future generations commissioner. And they have a very, very powerful role, if we look at the Welsh example, of really sitting down your wellbeing framework, making sure that the wellbeing framework has an advocate, that it's not just a case of retrospective badging, but actually policy decisions are informed by the wellbeing framework. But the other thing that it does, which I think is absolutely pivotal, and people have talked today about that 7th generation thinking, is it gives representation to one of those chairs, the people of the future. And the only reason I stepped out of the classroom and into politics was my own future generation came along, completely changed my worldview. And they need to be factored into decisions that we make today, because there's also been a lot of talk today about colonization. And what we are doing at the moment is we are colonizing the future, because we are asset stripping future generations. And I think that voice needs to be represented. I think we need to fill that chair. And that's one of the big areas that I'm pursuing in terms of trying to push forward policy, whereby we take a lead from what Wales have done, some very exciting work there, and push for an ombudsman or a commissioner for the future in the Irish context. And I am so sorry to be saying all of that and then leaving before I hear everybody else's contributions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marc. Thanks, Marc. I'm pretty good on time. It was about 4.5 minutes. See if Michael can do better. Can we bring up Michael?
Can you hear me, Patrick?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay, I'm not so sure I'm going to be able to do better, but I'll do my best at any rate. So I think just taking the actual theme of the conference to set this notion of rethinking growth. Of course, when we want to rethink something, one of the things we've got to think about is growth itself, and what are the things that kind of drive the infinitely expanding demand for goods and services. And to some extent, one of the reasons for that is that growth provides people with meaning, that the acquisition of particular kind of goods and services gives meaning or purpose to people's lives. So if we're going to rethink growth, it seems to me that one of the things we're going to have to rethink is precisely this question of the kind of the vision that people have, the stories they construct about their lives and where their future lives are going. And also, I think as well, about the kinds of resources that language or languages themselves provide them as a way of constructing, in many cases, particular kinds of stories, and in others, alternative kinds of stories. And this brings me to the Climate Action Plan. the biggest ever, 449 pages. It looks at all kinds of factors that are likely to impact on how we construct a future for ourselves: electricity, industry, the built environment, transport, agriculture. But as Marc has kind of alluded to there, there is no mention anywhere of language or culture. So the language, the Irish language, which described every field, every tree, every inlet, every waterway, every animal, and we're talking about the specificity of contribution. So on this island for over 2,000 years, which has continually narrated the interaction between people and the more than human world in song, in poetry, in narrative, and so on. There's not a single word about it. So if we are to take seriously the notion of how we construct a different story about what Ireland might look like and how we might express it, it seems to me that one of the very specific places that we can begin with is the language itself, which is so deeply embedded in the environmental makeup of this island, the only island that we have. So in order to activate this or make it a reality, it seems to me the first thing we've got to do is to take the language out of the classroom. We've got to bring the language into the streets, into the fields, into the forests, into the rivers. We've got to, in other words, construct a kind of an outdoors pedagogy for a language to be completely dominated, almost exclusively up to now, by an indoors pedagogy. And the idea behind this is the sense in which people can dwell knowingly in a place. One of the things, if you like, that's dogged I think a lot of Irish thinking and our rather poor environmental record is we've been fixated on a culture of possession rather than a culture of dwelling for perfectly understandable historical reasons, because the baleful effects of dispossession. But what we've neglected then is how to dwell knowingly in a particular place. And one of the things that assists or enables this is the language that emanates from, that's imminent from that particular place and landscape. And this applies as much to Dublin, Ballyachlia, Markham and Ishka, Sráide Hobarfóric, as it does to West Connemara or West Kerry. I think the second thing that mobilising language does is we move away from what Timothy Morton has called the eco-sinister mode when we talk about ecology. In other words, that ecology is almost invariably presented as something that is punitive, something that is subtractive, as something that diminishes in various ways, acts as a kind of constraint. So we're constantly engaged in this debate about sort of, policing old pleasures. But what do we think about ecological thinking as creating new ones? And one of the ways in which, of course, we can do this is through language itself, which offers people the opportunity to re-engage with the familiar world that they inhabit. In other words, in the words of Robert Macfarlane, a British nature writer, he says that the more closely we attend to something, the less likely we're to act selfishly towards it. So the more language we have to describe and to inhabit a particular landscape, at the particular island of Ireland that is our home, the more, if you like, committed or involved, and the more the experience, the pleasurable experience of discovering the sheer breadth and complexity of that interaction, that in itself is a powerful stimulus for present and future generations to take the language on board. Lastly, I would think one of the things that we don't talk often enough about, and this is why in many ways I think we constantly hear the discourse around how we miss various targets, is the fundamentally anthropological nature of rethinking growth. In other words, one of the things that I think has completely bedeviled environmental and ecological debates in Ireland is a form of STEM capture. The former president of UCD, Hugh Brady, in a recent interview in the Irish Times, he talked about the grand challenges facing humanity, many of whom are environmental. And he says that technology will have to be at the heart of the solution for all of these. I think that technology, of course, it can make a contribution, but the idea that it should be at the heart of strikes me spectacularly wrong-headed, because it seems to me that one of the things that we're living through at present is what the Korean thinker Chul Han calls a crisis of narration, and that the stories that are told to us by growth addicts and the climate deniers are stories that have proved to be extraordinarily compelling for people, and that people will do all kinds of things in the face of the most extraordinary evidence to the contrary, if they're committed to a particular story or narrative. And this is why I think one of the things that we have to think about is how do we develop a set of resistant counter narratives using the resources of language, of story, of song, of the arts, of the language of Irish, which just specifically maps on to our island home, and how we use these in order to, if you like, affect that sort of slow anthropological change in attitude that makes infinite destructive growth something of a former world rather than this one. I think I may have exceeded the 4 minutes there, so apologies.
That's all right. Thank you, Michael. A bit longer. I think there was about 6.5, was it? That's the difference between a politician and an academic. So now we have a curator. We'll see how we get on. Thanks, Annie.
Thank you so much. I will try and, yes, exactly, capture my space in between. Yeah. Thank you so much for this invitation, this very stimulating discussion. The quote I had in response to the kind of question is from a professor who taught me a long time ago in London, Irit Rogoff, and she said, "You can't have a position without a location." And it's something that I hold on to all the time. It's extraordinary. It's an extraordinarily simple statement, but it really means a lot. And yet I'm the director of an internationalist, modernist edifice that promises a kind of globalizing story, a kind of equalizing neutrality in which to experience modern and contemporary art. Modernism, literally that not only edifice, but that machine of growth that we're all trying to question right now. And so it's an extraordinarily interesting position, I think, to kind of be in Ireland, to understand what this model of the museum could be, the Irish Museum of Modern Art, so located, having a position, and yet all of these promises or these legacies that can be questioned or interrogated. And I find this an enormously fruitful position to be in, and especially to be back in Ireland after 25 years away, where I think it's an extraordinarily noisy and exciting moment to kind of understand that potential of the island and the specific location that we're in. I can just give you 2 quick examples of how I'm trying to think it in terms of how the museum's position could be one that is hopefully fruitful in intellectual growth and in artistic growth and dynamism and exchange, as distinct from a kind of another particular kind of economic growth. I see very much the museum as somewhere that should be capacity building for all of us. A place in which we can understand and enjoy the precision of our location and its heritages, but also the possibility and the excitement of exchange. So just to give 2 very quick examples, the project that we've just emerged out of was one that was, I think Ireland should be so proud of the decade of centenaries, the kind of the quality of investment in thinking about our complex history and our cultural expression, what was left out, what was left in, what we did right, what we did wrong, all of this kind of investment in considering a very complex history in the decade of centenaries, I think is only stood to us in lots and lots of new knowledge that has been developed. And as IMMA's part of that, we developed a project recently called Self-Determination, which was actually just trying to, again, place ourselves back, possibly in a historical model, but looking at the culture, looking at Irish artists and how they understood the great promise of self-determination. We all know it didn't necessarily end well or perfectly, especially when we looked at our neighbours after the trauma of the First World War. We were going into a fascist future, actually, with the Second World War. But there was a moment of noisiness and excitement that we wanted to consider. And we wanted to do that not only to place the Irish experience in a very located, very exciting way that did due diligence to the extraordinary quality of Irish practice, but also to insist on its place in a global argument. And therefore, we looked at the collapse of empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. We found affinities with places like Finland, which in a timeline had a civil war at the same time as us, a similar population. So there's something really important about this dialogue, this precision about where we are, and yet the expansive knowledge that we are not alone. That while we insist on the precision and the location of where we are through culture, we also insist on blowing up an idea of Irish exceptionalism. I think it's an extraordinarily damaging idea. It leads to essentialization, and it leads to, it's a cul-de-sac. It's much more exciting to be in a kind of dynamic dialogue with others and to share their solutions and our solutions with each other. And therefore, I think we're in an extraordinary moment now. One project that we want to develop is literally the question, why Ireland? Why now? Why is this place, in all of its potential that you've, I'm sure, heard of for the last two days, an extraordinary place to think from? And for me, one of the projects that I learned from self-determination that I want to tackle is the idea that we are 25 years after the peace process. There is a hard-fought idea of the technologies of peace. We fought, we won, through politics, through dialogue. We are still coming out of an extraordinary moment of both political collapse, and we'll all have to think about what that means in terms of self-censorship or shame of violence, all those kind of extraordinary things, and the iterations of self-determination. And yet, I think the museum is exactly the place, as is the university, as is many of the arts, a place to make these experiences quite intimate. And so that's, I think, our huge project in IMMA, is to think through these histories, these located histories, but dialogue them globally in a way that gives us a sense of not exceptionalism, not isolation, but actually company, intelligent company, and hopefully, as I said, intellectual growth and dynamism. And so that's really what I see the job of the museum. The museum, as many talk about it, it's a zombie, it's an edifice of modernism. You can't quite kill it. So let's use it. Let's use the scale and the visibility of it as a public institution to be a kind of an intimate, cultural and safe space to think big ideas. Thank you.
Thanks, Annie. That was great. I think Saoirse is next.
Yeah, I suppose when I think about the climate crisis, the environment in general, I like to use Murray Bookchin's kind of, I don't think he defined it or came up with it, but he wrote extensively about it in his book, The Ecology of Freedom, which I would highly recommend. And it's this idea of social ecology. The reality, basically, this is that human beings, we tend to think of ourselves as almost alien to the planet that we're on, when in reality, we are as much a part of the ecosystems as any other element of the natural world. We are natural from the invention of the wheel to, I don't know, the invention of a train. It's all natural. It's all part of ecology developing. And so I think when we look at the climate crisis specifically through a lens of cultural value, we need to remember that it doesn't just threaten our future, it also threatens our past and what has come before. And I think we also have to challenge that past. So I think we have language, as Michael Cronin talked about, but we also have our stories, we have our mythology, and I think if the language gives words to the land, if it means that we understand it better, the mythology makes the land living, because every single hill, every stream, every river has a personality, a character. Even if we don't necessarily believe that it is scientifically there, there's that feeling of magic with a name to it. So I think it's really, really important that when we look at ourselves and we understand that we are part of nature, we are part of the natural world, and we are nature defending itself as well. I recently read a book called Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe, which I would highly recommend. It essentially debunks the myth that Aboriginal Australians were hunter-gatherers and proves, mostly through the first-person descriptions of Indigenous structures by always racist and genocidal white settlers. It's their words from their journals. They describe these intricate fish traps with holes in them that allow the smaller fish to escape so that the fish stock won't be depleted. They describe these huts that are built in a very strangely similar to old Irish huts, wattle and daub in that style, with a hole at the top for the smoke to go through and a low doorway to keep out the cold and the heat. It describes these mass gatherings of people, these again, guided by language, guided by storytelling. And I think, it also describes the root tubers that were cultivated by the Indigenous people. They had a surplus of food, which is, it just debunks this whole idea that they were somehow less developed than anyone else. And I think it proves to us, we as Irish people have a very close connection to Indigenous Australians because of the fact that so many people with our DNA went and killed them by the millions and removed them from their land. But I think there's also lessons to be learned there too. From our history, from the history of other nations and other peoples, we have the unique opportunity to cherry pick, to go, you know what, maybe we should bring back our language. Maybe we should value nature and ecosystems and stories as all the same thing. Anyway, yeah.
Thanks, Saoirse.
Okay, so give me a total 3-minute check.
I will.
A minute before actually would be fabulous.
Will do.
How are you all doing? All right, I want you to take a look around the room, right? This is who we've been waiting for this revolution, by the way, the people in this room. So I expect a list of your actions, culturally or otherwise, publicly acknowledged within a week after this event. That would be awesome. So I had a whole lot of things I was going to say. I even made a presentation despite Davey saying to me yesterday, you don't have slides, that's brilliant. So I then went and made slides. The counterculture deep. So I'm Roisin Markham. I'm the steward of 12 oaks. We've recently discovered 5 little oaks also on the land that we steward. And as we have been rewilding the land, it's been rewilding us. And I'm speaking to you in the context as somebody who spent the first decade of her career in big tech globally, and the second decade of her career working hyper-locally as a community artist and community educator. And the third, I'm that old, and the third decade kind of figuring out this space between spaces as a systems thinker and as a strategic designer when there wasn't language for the kind of work that I practice that's in the spaces between things. In 2020, the Donut Economic Action Lab appeared and COVID was hitting hard. So it was this unique time that I started hosting weekly conversations for a year and a half in an Irish context with whoever wanted to show up. And not purposely, but this is how things happen. A network of people interested in Kate Raworth's incredible ideas around donut economics and how to think like a 21st economist emerged. Now, I can speak about the practical things that we've been doing in the last 4 years and how we're shifting from working with policymakers in the last years to this year looking at the deep design of business. I can acknowledge IMMA for accepting in the first Eco Earth Rising Festival, allowed us to go and spend the whole weekend practicing donut economics in the walled, or in the garden, in this fabulous space, out across Dublin, just teaching people the ideas and how to get into action around donut economics. And that's a lot of what I'm interested in. Culturally, we can talk about the things we're going to do, but culture, somebody earlier on said, culture is made by us. It's what it is to all of us. So every single person here, think about something that's important to you culturally. And I can guarantee you it'll be different potentially to the person sitting beside you. I can also guarantee you that if we go outside and walk 3 minutes, it'll be different to the person who lives in that place, as opposed to us coming into this space and having this enclosed conversation. So there's a great quote that I often go back to: design creates culture, culture creates values, values determine the future. It's by a guy called Robert L. Peter. And so this vacant chair, very nicely vacated, as the person spoke about long-termism and also the future generations. And if we might think that there's another space here, that's our nature, beings, and other relations that we are all in, whether we know it or not. This is the present moment in which we are deciding things about the impact of our society on the planet. At a session earlier on, I spoke about the fact that we need a radical transformation. Somebody I know well who's sitting spinning wool, she's like, where's the rebellion? It's not radical enough. What we're talking about is like still really safe. Do we realize we have 6 years left? And so culturally, what we need are cultural institutions and the culture within ourselves, whether it's nature beings or how else we, graffiti, how else we describe culture. We need that to show up with new narratives, and we need to own that social imagination in a way that says it's all welcome, it's all part of what we need to be doing. These multiple entry points, the not gatekeeping, the opening of historical institutes and saying, come in, let's work on this together. What do you want to do? How do we figure this out? How do you get funding? And how do we resource ourselves and our young people to be in action beyond talking about it? So the networks that are here and that are developing are really critical. And I'm going to keep, so anybody who wants to talk about this, I'm really happy and open to discuss it further. I'll share the slides later so you have the benefit of some beautiful designed graphics made with AI. I'm going to own that. But I do use an AI indicator when I'm working with images. I do use an AI indicator on them because I think it's really important. There is a politics about citation, and having those links and those networks are really critical. There's so much more I could say. Culturally, I'm known as a cultural thinker, and like I'm here for the revolution, right? Even if it's done through expressive dance, we'll get Pascal Donoghue on the dance floor. But I think we need to be much more radical in even how we're showing up.
Thanks. Thanks, Roisin. Go ahead, Seán.
I'm going to go ahead, Dan. And you're all great to stay awake at this stage, I think. We're coming near the end of the journey of the day and a half. I suppose I addressed it slightly differently to the other speakers, although there's an awful lot that I would agree with. the role that we saw for the whole We All hub in Ireland was to shine a light on the social imaginary that we're working in, living in, and so on, and also to help, particularly using artists and creatives. And I've often been pulled up by saying we're all artists, and I do believe that. I've often had to remind myself I'm an engineer and a dreamer. But the second part is to create something. The first part is to understand and to shine a light on where we are. And we all saw it with the minister. The minister is a very capable professional, but he's working within a social imaginary, and I'm not even sure that he understands that. So one part is, so what is there a response in Ireland, on the island, which is different to other places? And what can we offer other countries? Can we be different? Can we be better in the sense that can we achieve more? Can we address these things in a different way? And I suppose my address to that is, well, what makes us different? I think we all accept that, as Irish people living on the island, we're living out in the Atlantic with the whole environment that we're in. And very often, if you visit another country, we all know French culture or German culture or Italian culture, and we know they're different, but what is it that makes us different? And I kind of went back. There's a lovely quote that Peter Dorn has when he did the call to action by James Joyce, no less, which says that the Irish imagination is at its best when it's moving between two twinsome thoughts, two twinsome minds. That is, when it has two thinks at a time. And I said, well, what does that mean? And I thought of so many examples. One big example here today is about the Irish language. So the Irish language is the first official language in the state. Probably most people here went through years of learning it in school, and there's hardly been a word spoken about it. And that for me is a twinsome thought. Tá gaeilge cuiseach líofa a gomsa, agus tá áras orm an teanga labhairt, mar tá is agam, I'm making a big statement if I go speaking in Irish. And it used to be a Republican if you spoke Irish, but we can accept all that as Irish people. Another great example, it's gone a little bit past now, but we used to have cars in Ireland that measured in miles per hour, and you had gallons on the indicator, but the signs on the road were in kilometers, and you bought liters of petrol. And we read about miles per gallon and liters per 100 kilometers, and we just totally accepted that. That's the way it is. That's the way it is. So we're great at doing that. We're also great at storytelling and incorporating mythology into our lives. And I don't want to give too many examples, but I remember in school, I could never figure out whether Cuchulainn was a real person or not, or whether Diarmid and Grania, with all these caves they went around the country, they actually were there somewhere. But we accepted them. Queen Maeve, was Queen Maeve there or was she not there? What did she do? What about the Tán Dó Cúailnge and all those, and the Tuatha Dé Danann and all these stories we have? And when did history start? When did reality occur to us? So we're great at that. And if you want backing up on that, I was a great fan of two Dutch sociologists, Hofstede and Trompenaars, who came up with indicators for countries. And for Ireland, I just picked out two. One was uncertainty avoidance. So different countries avoid uncertainty, like Germans hate uncertainty. Everything has to be on time and organized. In Ireland, we have a very low indicator of avoidance because we don't mind uncertainty. We accept uncertainty, that's the way it is. And that's partially because of our history. So based on that, I said, well, we have to come up with a different approach from an Irish point of view because of these characteristics, and I'll come up with another one later on. So I said, well, maybe we should have, and particularly based on some of the talk so far, we should really go for a bottom-up approach in Ireland to this. You know, we shouldn't expect our politicians all to change totally. We should go and we should really go for the commons in a big way, because the commons really is attractive to the Irish culture of equality and so on. And by the way, that was the second indicator that I picked out, that we, on the power distance indicator, according to my two sociologist friends, we were very high on that. Or in other words, sorry, we had a very low power distance relation. I could relate to the minister coming in as Pascal. I didn't have to say Mr. Minister. In Germany, if you meet a professor, it's Herr, Doctor, Professor, and you would never call him by his first name. So we're used to this approach of cooperation and equality and justice, and we have a relatively non-hierarchical society. So why don't we use it? But we need leadership in that, and leadership into the commons. And I'd look to Manon Ahern, as an old man, I would say, I look to the women of Ireland, and we saw it here among the university staff, because ultimately this common approach, the approach to commons, and I'll bring us into values, which is the other thing, a renaissance of values. It links into what Marc talked about yesterday, or maybe it was this morning, Marc Aravan, about bringing care to the top. You know, we need to have a caring society. It's not valued. It doesn't appear on the frameworks, the metrics or anything, but we really, really need it. We need care for ourselves. We need the state to take care of us, but we also need to care for nature. We need to care for our landscape and so on. And women are the natural leaders in caring. So I know women have been burdened with it before and it hasn't been recognized, but they understand it. You know, you understand it much, much better than men. So I wonder, could you go for it? So I look to females to do that. So this change of values and renaissance of values, I think links in with what Michael Cronin was saying about language and place names. And don't get me going on place names, all our place names. And why do we suffer the gobbledygook that's not even English, that's bigger than the real Irish place names that have meanings? So we need to change that. And finally, the last thing I want to say is we live, particularly on an island basis, with many entangled narratives that come from different communities and through our history that I know in school, I didn't hear the other narratives. I didn't hear the narratives about the big houses, for example, and the good that they did during our history. I didn't learn that they didn't cut down all the trees. You know, I thought, you know, if I go back to Kilcash, Cathasaigh, Feasta, gan IMMA, what was taught to us was it was all these foreign invaders who cut down the trees. That wasn't true. But we need to hear these different narratives and appreciate them. So finally, and to close, I think we can do things differently. I think we are different. It doesn't mean I don't respect, and I speak French and German and Dutch and several other languages. I appreciate all those, but I'm fundamentally living on this island and I speak Gaeilge, and I want to show the way as well, and I think we can do that.
So, thank you, all of our speakers. I'm not quite sure, I'm looking at the organizers now about time. Okay, easy. Okay, somebody from the north who wants to put up their hand. I'm looking at John Barry, but... Okay, there's a question there at the back. I don't know if there's a... Thanks.
I'm not sure I had a question, just responded that I'm from the north, so. But Thank you, Nuala. Actually, my question was, it was a little bit intimated in there around peace. So there seems something interesting about our learning distinctively on the island around that. It's also been talked about the border thinking earlier on in the conference. So I'm from a border area, well, quite a lot of Northern Ireland's a border area now, one way or t'other. But is there something about what we have learned in making peace together that is very useful for this conversation?
Great question. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And actually, Kevin, I was going to ask you to talk about the work we all creative community is doing if you didn't find a question. I do want to respond to that because that's one of the realizations I've had since one of the coming together of the We All creative community in Cloughjordan last summer. I've been sitting with this question for 8 or 9 years about how do we have these really tough questions. And I don't know if it was being in proximity to some of the Northern of Ireland folk at that event, but I came away from that event and at some stage, you know, as you're processing or holding the two thoughts, you know, being in the landscape or hurtling through it, I kind of had the realization, we know how to have tough questions. We know how to have polarizing conversations. It's been done really well and modeled for us up the north, and they brought it all around the world. And we can maybe utilize that way of listening circles and hosting bigger conversations to get us from where we are now to where we need to go in a transition or transformation or whatever that is. The burden should not be on the people who've experienced the trauma around that. And it's really important that we also don't burden the young people that we have in our spaces with that, but we teach them the skills and we partner with them and we show up to have those really difficult conversations in a way that's informed and trauma-led.
Thanks. Annie, would you want to? Yeah.
I think it's a great question. It's exactly what I want to spend the next 4 years of my directorship, because then I'm out, thinking about, because I think it's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary, not only to the capacity to understand complexity, to understand different ideologies in terms of culture and how we express ourselves, but we are an exemplar right now, you know, and there's something really joyous about understanding that and thinking that. And I don't think we need to worry too much about the young people. Look how noisy and amazing the practices that are coming out of all of the island in relation to their own voicing and acknowledgement and thinking about what this island means now, meant then, could mean in the future. We are in a massive moment of transformational change, and we are bracketed by polarization on all kinds of levels. And yet we are a kind of extraordinary success story that needs to be thought carefully about and owned and acknowledged and shared.
Exactly. I think we have to wrap it up, but you see one question from someone from the north and it opens everything up. Should have had someone on the panel, but I'd like to thank our speakers who were all pretty close to time, which was very difficult, and very eloquent and concise, and all had really interesting, insightful things to say. So thank you very much.